You're listening to Tech Me Seriously with Sarah Tenisi, CEO of TenisiTech. Candid conversations with driven technology and business professionals who've always got something interesting to say.
Hi, I'm Sarah Tenisi, the host of Tech Me Seriously and CEO of TenisiTech, an IT services firm headquartered in California. Well, I feel like this conversation is way overdue. Today, I'm thrilled to be speaking with TenisiTech's own Carlo Cacciatore. Carlo is a partner of and VP of operations for TenisiTech. He's super passionate about building IT services that delight TenisiTech customers and ensuring that security and productivity are the priority for all of the clients we support. Today, we'll be discussing IT pricing and explaining what we've seen over more than a decade of providing services to clients in various sizes and in various industries. So welcome, Carlo. I'm super excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. I am super excited to be on this podcast as well with you today.
Finally, right? I'm like, well, why didn't we start off with you?
It's been a long time in the making, for sure.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. And, you and I've talked about doing lots of different discussions around things that we're seeing in the IT industry. So I'm really excited to kind of start with this one. I think, talking about IT pricing is always like an uncomfortable or feels a little bit uncomfortable sometimes because I feel like people don't necessarily know what it is they're paying for. So let's kind of start there. Like, why are we having this conversation today?
Yeah, I think like our biggest challenge anytime talking to leaders, business owners, executives who own IT is really understanding the scope, value, impact of day-to-day IT operations and really being consultative educators at the end of the day, right? Because when we go in to talk to businesses about what problems they're facing, what the results are that they're looking for, there's so much in the middle that I think is misunderstood, glossed over. And like I said, our goal is to be consultative and kind of share that IT maturity journey, right? And ideally, we're hoping to be the ones to work with these businesses and help lead them on these efforts. But at the end of the day, we see in the IT space such a variance in quality, right? Because of industries matured. One of the things I've always thought was interesting is that, there are no license requirements to be in IT and own an MSP, right? And so anybody could be performing IT for any business. And you think about the requirements around, getting your hair cut and like all these other, an electrician, all these other industries, and IT companies deal with sensitive medical data, financial data companies, all of this like complex, consumer personal data, and anyone can kind of step in and say, hey, I'll do this for X amount of dollars. And so obviously what we're trying to bring to the table is much different from that perspective with that enterprise experience, these true enterprise best in class tools. I'm excited to jump into this conversation with you today about that.
It's so fun. And I mean, the thing that's interesting, like when you say like, we're not just hanging a shingle, kind of talk a little bit more that I think that is one of the biggest problems that we come across. And I always think about people that are like, oh, we got this quote for whatever, the barest minimum price. And you're like, what are they going to do for you? And they're like, everything. And then you find out that, yeah, it's like some cousin's Joe or somebody's cousin Joe that's doing it, right? Like some dude that maybe is successful at like helping grandma with an iPad and now he's on the shingle.
Yeah, very common when we're talking to businesses who are looking to, get a new IT partner. Oftentimes they have a family friend, a friend of a friend who, was good with a computer and they helped them set up their network and their wireless. And now they're, working on their server and all of a sudden, it cascades and somebody with, that true enterprise experience needs to come in and kind of clean that stuff up.
Right. And we do kind of pride ourselves on this idea that we look for people that don't have just MSP experience, which by the way, is really important in and of itself. And we've talked about that a lot, but that's not for today. So when you talk about kind of the gap, like what people want, the reality of what they have today, could you talk a little bit more about what is in the gap?
As far as like the services that they're receiving when we're typically, in initial discussions with them or?
Yeah, I mean, there's that gap. There's also, I feel like the awareness gap. Like, when we're talking to people, I feel like, or I think most people in the world, right? Think about your friends that you go over to their house and they're like, can you fix my printer? Like there's a gap gap in understanding of what an IT team looks like. So let's start with that gap.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great starting point, because I think when most people think of IT, they're thinking of, hey, I can't print, like my laptop won't turn on, right? And that is an important piece of the puzzle, right? What any employee steps into for their workday and turns on, like that is that user experience that we try to pin down. But obviously, there are so many systems and mechanisms and maintenance and security configurations required to deliver that end result at the end of the day, right? And so we see this front-facing experience of, a mobile device like a laptop, an iPad, something for someone to go out in the field. But there are many, many systems, ensuring that that device is secured, that there are data and systems that they can access from it anywhere. And then having all of those systems tied together, maintained, there's an incredible infrastructure and security aspect to this. And it's all now like cloud security, cloud sec focused work, as opposed to, what we were seeing 5 to 10 years ago, really focused on securing the laptop, maybe your firewall and perimeter at your network and office. Now it's all about, hey, how do you secure your cloud accounts, your cloud data? How do you integrate those systems so that they work together efficiently and stay secure? And so that's the story we try to tell without getting, too into the details on it, and really talking about, that's the hardest part, because you want to explain like, hey, there's a lot of work that goes into this, but like, what's the why behind it, right? You're trying to, protect your customers' data, whether that's consumer data, consumer personal data, whether that's, other business partners you're working with. There's a, huge integrity piece to your business, your brand, when you are working with, other companies out there, and you want to make sure that, you can stand tall and secure that information that you're working with across the board on that.
100%. Well, let me jump in here, because there's like the gap of understanding that it's not just about what you see in desktop support. What about like the idea that, is this a one person job? Because that's the other, I think, misconception, right? Is, well, we just need an IT guy. So we're going to go hire Joe off the street, who's Elizabeth's, cousin.
The mythical solo IT person. And if you talk to folks who are in the IT industry, both internal employees at startups, other enterprise businesses, SMB businesses, or MSP, you'll hear stories of the single person at the startup. And I was one of those people. And, being on the other side of this, I think when we talk about the value that an organization like ours brings to the table, or other mature MSPs in the industry, is that there's such a comprehensive backing of experience across the board, right? Like, we have people on our side who are cloud security experts, who are automation, experts, building out tools, these new AI integration opportunities that we're seeing across all of our platforms. Folks specializing in device management and like how to really, ensure that workstation experience is beautiful for people. And so we're able to tap all these different experiences where no one of those people could do all of that and be as good as they are at it.
It's kind of like any other profession, right? Like, you think about the legal profession, and there's literally, there's probably more than 20 different legal specialists that deal with everything from patents to corporate law, whatever, like
maritime law. There's people who just do
maritime law, divorce law, like you name it, family law, you name it, right? And I think that's kind of the analogy I like to use, is like, it's not like one person can do everything. Like, that's such a broad range. And part of the trick, I think, for a company like ours is we better have the right people in all these different areas, because we're actually selling security of infrastructure. And so you really cannot expect, and I really think this is a failing of leadership, to expect one person to manage it all. I think you could probably manage it all if you were like, 10 people, no servers? I don't know. I don't even know where that is, to be honest, because it's tricky.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of companies get by early on, right? You kind of get some of the basics together, people pitch in and do little parts of it. And I think you end up in a place where there's a little bit of a false confidence that develops. And it might get you by, for early stages of a company where you're 5 to 10 people. But as soon as that number balloons and you're 10, 20, 30 many people, those processes, tools that were in place aren't going to scale, the way that they did when, it was a scrappy small group.
Exactly. So, and I loved what you said earlier about the mythical one person IT team, because we've, you and I together have been in places where they talk about, oh, we do all of our IT in house, or we have a guy. And we're not talking about this exactly right now, but we love to start with the finance team and just say, hey, show us invoices so we can get an idea of what your IT spend is. And then it turns out that there's like 5 or 6 other vendors in place. So it really is a myth that any one person is doing all of this stuff.
Yeah, more often than not, companies really don't have any idea how much they're spending on IT as it's today, whether that's from extra services they might not need to other vendors that overlap and are doing different parts of the same, puzzle.
Licensing, yeah,
everything. And when you get that, when you help them navigate kind of that discovery exercise, the lights go on. And it turns out they do have an IT budget they're spending a lot of money on today.
That's right. I love that too, because we talk about that too. What's your IT budget? I do not think in the entire history of us working together and having TenisiTech that we ever had someone go, here's the budget.
Yeah.
I really can't think of one, right? So that's the other thing. So we're able to kind of do that with finance. Okay, so it's kind of funny, right? Because when we're thinking about IT and how we do our pricing, there's lots of different ways to think about it. Is it a per seat cost? Is it a fixed cost? And I think that we've sort of tried different things in our history. What are your thoughts on those two different methods?
Yeah, I think it really, like, what we try to pin down, what are we supporting and what are we delivering on, right? And at the end of the day, that is the fleet of workstations and the systems that, are in the back end supporting all the tools that you need from a day-to-day perspective. And so, when I think of the most effective ways to price out what it's going to take to support any given company, like, it comes down to, how many computers are in your environment at the end of the day, and what is the complexity of that back-end infrastructure. We see 20-person companies that are totally cloud native, and, there isn't a large development environment that's required, and they're just using their cloud SaaS tools. And that's a really efficient, like, more straightforward company to manage versus startup development company in the AI space that, has a giant AWS farm that they need support on, and has a lot of different requirements than what you'd see in, say, like a nonprofit.
Right. And like the 300-person nonprofit, so I liked what you were saying there. It really has everything to do with complexity, right? So what are those complexity points? I mean, you mentioned a couple of them, right? Are you cloud native? What are a couple other ones?
Yeah. Do you have compliance requirements that you have to navigate, or there are internal audits that need to be ran and more stringent processes and tools in place to support those efforts? I would also say, like, physical office locations. We see some really large companies with one office location or hybrid or predominantly remote. And we see large companies that have 20, 30 small satellite sites that they have to support. And so obviously when you are taking that into consideration, there's a pretty significant difference in the hands-on requirements. Be able to go support those sites in person, ensure their connectivity to each other, their security with each other, and so on.
Yeah. What about the idea of, like, I always think about this because when we talk about how companies could reduce their IT spend, one of the things that we talk about is, have a workforce that has basic computer skills. I mean, is that something you feel like, are those conversations you're having or not really?
I mean, it's tough, right? Like, those are hard conversations. I think partly because, companies are so focused on their goals and their mission, and depending on, what they're doing, asking for additional training on something that might feel extracurricular can be tough, right? Like, say in healthcare nonprofit space where they're really on the ground supporting their clients who, potentially are a vulnerable population. They have large caseloads, saying, hey, they need to spend more time learning how to use their computer. That could be a hard sell in that scenario. I think that is, once again, where great partners come into play, because it's like, how do we make this as easy to use as possible? The problem with that ultimately is it does require investment to build that out. right? When you talk about a seamless experience for signing in across all of your apps, well, that doesn't happen automatically, right? Like that needs to be built. You have to have the right type of tools in place to get there. There's potentially spend on tools, licensing, implementation, and that could feel daunting, right? Like it's like, how do we start this and how do we get there? The other big piece of, I think, helping executives understand that story is it often doesn't all have to be done at once. Talking about and being able to quantify, savings on time and experience for their workforce, and then parsing that out over kind of an achievable period of time where, this isn't going to happen in 1 month or 1 quarter. This is going to be across the year or 18 months, being able to report on that progress, in a meaningful way is, I think, what gets us there as we move forward. And what's really cool that we're seeing in these new tools centered around, automation and robotics for these platforms is that there's built-in reporting to quantify time savings, right? So as you automate a process, you build out a new process, there's a tracker for every time that process and automation is triggered. And hey, if somebody spent 2 minutes clicking through something in the past, and that happened at your organization 500 times a month, every time that's triggered, it will report on it and tell you how much time you're saving.
I love that. We're going to have a whole conversation about automation and AI, 100%. That's got to be another topic for us. So we were talking about kind of complexity and I think what drives IT cost. And there was the idea of how much ease of use do you want, right? Because obviously, if you want a super streamlined solution, you're gonna have to pay some money. And then the other thing we were talking about is, do people need to learn computers? And I love that kind of angle that you're saying is like, look, it depends on what they're doing day to day. And we have so many professionals that are helping vulnerable populations, right? So they've got a whole other thing that they have to deal with. Our director of service and I, Michael and I are going to have that conversation too, in terms of what does it take to support different user populations in a meaningful way. And so the other thing I was thinking about complexity is like age of equipment and software. How does that kind of lead into IT?
That's obviously a very important thing to take into consideration. And I think for me, as I'm navigating discovery and talking with businesses about their goals and, talking about what it'll take to achieve those goals, I think what I'm looking for than a current state of affair is a commitment to achieve those goals, right? So if I talk to an organization where, say they're a 100-person company and all of their computers are, no longer supported, they're end of life, they're over 5 years old, they're falling apart, there's some current team patching them together week to week, day to day. And they said, hey, we're committed to allocating budget to getting these updated and having a proper hardware lifecycle practice in place where we replace, 20 computers a year, which is equating to 5 a quarter, every quarter moving forward, so we don't end up in this place. It's much easier to get more aggressive on pricing than a company saying, hey, I don't think we're going to be able to replace these computers anytime soon. That's a really tough place to put any IT team in.
I was going to say.
Yeah. And we've gotten to the point where you almost can't partner with an organization that is not willing to commit to making those improvements, because at the end of the day, we're not magicians, right? We put systems, processes in place, current enterprise level IT systems, but we can't an old broken computer and turn it into something usable for 100 employees. Like, it doesn't work that way.
So hard. And I think that's been some of our maturity too, is getting that partnering buy-in from the beginning, because if the answer is no, we have been in that position. Every MSP has been in this position, at least with a couple of clients, until they learn, wait a minute, if we don't have that buy-in from you that you're willing to spend to get current, then it's just not, it can't work, right? Because all of a sudden an IT team is going to spend 5 times as long supporting an environment, and kind of building that into a pricing model is really tricky, right?
And I think we used to see it a lot more in the past on the infrastructure side. Like, this would probably jog your memory so quickly, but how many times would you walk into a new business and, there's this old ugly server rack and there's all these boxes that are on and people can't even tell you what they're doing or why they're still on or what applications or services are even running on those things.
Like maybe it's your production facing, portal for all of your customers that's 8 years old and the company's gone out of business. And
yes.
Oh my God.
I thought that would jog your memory. So anyway, I don't think we run into that as much anymore, right? As companies are more and more focused on, these cloud platforms and solving problems with these SaaS tools. We don't see that, but we do see it with the computer fleets, the workstation fleets, the laptops, the iPads, the mobile devices. And I think it can get tricky. And it's really tricky when, you talk to an organization, 500 people, and they spent $1 million replacing their 500 devices 5 years ago, but they didn't plan on staging it out in a manner where they could, slowly start refreshing those. And they're in this position where, hey, we got to replace 500 again all at once.
Well, and I mean, we've been in those scenarios where it's like, hey, we've had all of these machines sitting in a storage closet for 3 years. And that always, for me, like when I was kind of running IT as a director, that was always really stressful because, like we always say, IT does not age like wine, right? You have like 3 to 5 years on a piece of equipment, so you can't let it sit in a storage closet for a year and a half before it even gets deployed. And I think we see that a lot too, because then all of a sudden your IT team has to say, hey, the life that you thought you were going to get out of this might not be as long. I think that's super tricky. Would you say in general, customers that are sort of cloud focused, that is their strategy, cloud first, right? What can we do? What tools exist out in the cloud so that we don't have to build infrastructure? Is that a way customers could decrease spend? Is cloud first cheaper than on-prem generally?
I think absolutely from a supportability perspective, I think a flexibility perspective, there are still going to be scenarios for certain businesses that are, potentially working with large amounts of data and things like that, where
like our biotech friends, right, that are just going to store it first.
I think of, any companies working on large files like architecture, printing,
design firms. Yeah.
But outside of that, it's pretty rare that it would make sense to try to build that infrastructure on site.
Inside. When you're talking about like a cost for IT, and let's just call it a per seat cost, even though we've gone back and forth on this a lot, like we don't like the transactional aspect of per seat necessarily because we don't want to feel like it's a transaction between us and our clients. But when you're pricing or when you're thinking about what it costs, let's just call it per seat for the sake of discussion, because there's a lot that goes into that. Can you talk a little bit about, like, when we're providing the service, what do we come to the table with that results in the pricing?
Yeah, there's two main pieces to this, I think, when we talk about impact and what companies are looking for out of their partner. The first one is the people, right, that we're delivering. And so that's the support they're receiving, the partnership, having regionally based people that are available to partner on solving their problems. So whether that's the front lines, reactive support when something breaks, that's their account manager, that's engineering for more complicated problems. That is probably the most expensive part of what they're paying for working for any IT team. And I think when you see the race to the bottom, in our industry, you can easily see where that service degrades, right? Whether that's really long wait times to get a hold of somebody, whether that's offshore resources in different time zones that present challenges on connecting in a timely manner. I think that's the bulk, right? That's a big chunk. And then the second part are the tools that your partner's bringing to the table. And this is something that's ebbed and flowed in the industry, and we've ebbed and flowed on, as far as what we're bringing to the table and what's included just as a table stake part of our service. And the farther we've come in this journey, the more that we try to fit into that included package. Because, what we've learned is that companies come to us because they want expertise. They want to know, hey, what should we be doing? And at the end of the day, most of these are security tools and management tools that are going to put them in position to be successful. Instead of going to a company and starting to work with them and then trying to sell these tools, I think up front, we've found a lot more success saying, this is what you need to be successful. We are going to bake this stuff into the cost up front, so you know exactly what to expect from a budget perspective, and you're going to get everything you need. And our job is to not put more than they need in there, right? Like, we're not selling the companies we partner with extra stuff that is a nice to have. Like, these are core foundational professional security tools, management tools that will allow their executives to put their head on their pillow at night and know, like, hey, we're at a much reduced risk of being breached or compromised in any way.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically, like what are those tools? And I don't mean the names of the tools, but like you said, security and productivity, like what are some of the examples? Like,
yeah, the big ones are going to be around asset management and patching compliance, right? So ensuring your workstation fleet is accounted for, it's being monitored, it's being patched. I think the next biggest ones are your security tools. So for cloud security and ITDR solution, that stands for identity threat detection and response. That is the new thing to ensure your online identity accounts are protected and that there's an extra layer of security on those.
and those would help prevent things like phishing and unauthorized access, i.e., they're looking at your behavior. They're almost a behavioral analytics tool, right? To make sure that it's not normal for Carlo to send 1,000 emails out at 6 a.m.
On the other side of the world, right? And so that's a huge one. And the next one would be that. And the next one, kind of in the same vein, would be your workstation security tools. So, we're working with similar partners, providing that next gen AV experience with monitor detection response. So there's like a back end 24/7 team supporting the monitoring and remediation of any security events.
And then the only other one I was thinking of that's a big one is like your help desk, like your ticketing, your remote support, all the service management tools. It's not like you guys walk in and say, okay, like you pay us all this money and on top of it, buy all these tools. Like you show up with everything someone needs from an IT ops perspective.
And then the final one that we are using across the board, this is, I think, less about adding cost in and there being additional costs, but just like a cost burden that we've taken on because we believe in the future of this is around operations automation.
That's so exciting.
We have taken it upon ourselves to invest in a platform that we could bring to all our customers to start automating their IT related workflows and then potentially even their business operation workflows.
I'm so excited about that.
Of this product. So that's going to be really fun and definitely more to come on those conversations.
Super excited about that. So let's talk a little bit, kind of our last topic around IT pricing is challenges for MSPs. And any of our MSP buddies would be able to add to this list, I'm sure.
We touched on it at the beginning, right? Anyone can hang a shingle and anyone can ship a proposal, right? And so we all of the time, talk to companies who don't know what IT operations should look like, could look like. And they say, hey, I'm paying, $800 a month to support my 50 employees. If you immediately dig into that, you really quickly realize that they're really not getting any service for that. Hence why they're experiencing the outages, the security incidents, the problems, the lack of support, and why they're talking to other potential partners out there. Or, in the other scenario, they don't have anything right now and they talk to 3 or 4 companies and 1 or 2 of them will come in with a proposal like that. And it'll be a very transactional proposal. It won't include, the tools that they need. It probably won't deliver on a level of service that would keep employees working efficiently and satisfied. And so it's really hard to compare apples to apples in a scenario like
really about apples to apples, and the way that people provide support is so varied that it's challenging. That's definitely one. What about this one? This is my favorite one from kind of an existing client perspective. IT is running so well. Can we now spend less or nothing?
Yeah, it's a big one that you see out there a lot is, what are we paying you for? Things are just working. And hence all of these maintenance programs that we have in place and, these tools that we manage to keep environments healthy. And so we've always joked that IT can feel a little bit thankless from that perspective. And I do think that is why a partner that helps educate along those lines and talks about journey. And we know that people are focused on their business. We don't want to bore them to death about IT operations and I think put people to sleep with PowerPoint slides about the details of our work, but we do want to educate around the level of effort, the value, and the risk reduction in the work we do, and be as efficient as possible in educating and being consultative on that storyline.
Well, and I think that one is that one I feel like is the trickiest thing that MSPs have to navigate, because the goal is to be invisible with everything that you're talking about, right? Those maintenance programs, IT people are working overnight so that employees don't get impacted, whether it's a patching program or a rollout, delivery of a new service or whatever else. And I think that that's kind of always the line is like, hey, you really are paying us to keep it invisible. It's foundational. It's something that you need your business to operate on. But if it's that invisible, all of a sudden you think you shouldn't be spending any money. And I think that one just, I think, sums it up, because it's like, hey, that was the goal, is to get you in a place where it feels like you don't need it. But the reality is that this is like what we were talking about that at the very beginning, is there's so much more happening behind the scenes. And you're right. It's not like we don't want to ad nauseum explain all the minutia of a service. But at the same time, I think that that's the goal, is to make our clients feel like they don't need IT because it's running so well. And that therein lies the rub, I feel like.
I think it always is a difference maker when you have internal leaders that own IT who are invested in its success, right? If they're able to take that small amount of time to, I think, understand day to day, just on a basic level to help support the partnership, that goes an incredibly long way.
And then here's another thing that I feel like is happening. And there's kind of I want to wrap talking about kind of what we're seeing from, the private equity investment angle. But before we even get there, what I wanted to ask about is, how about this scenario? I feel like this is really common. Our current MSP is not as good as we like. It takes too long. I think what we hear all the time is it takes too long to get basic support, right? We want a new MSP, but we also want to pay less.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all over the place on LinkedIn. I mean, this is the trickiest thing that I feel like we deal with, right? It's like, well, everyone knows you get what you pay for. You're unhappy, but you want it cheaper. How does that work?
Yeah, it's really hard to marry those two worlds. And like, that is it at the end of the day, right? It's just like if you were to go get your bathroom remodeled or like some work done on your house, you get what you pay for. 100%. If somebody's coming in, far under, an industry standard or expectation, like, the result will probably be under. And it's hard to navigate those conversations where, people at the end of the day are probably getting what they're paying for, and they're looking for a better experience, but they also, don't necessarily have the budget to get there. And so, that's tough. I understand that businesses are, more cognizant than ever on expense and trying to understand that. And so, like, what I try to do during those conversations is, further outline how much more spend is probably happening because of those challenges than they might even understand, right? So I think the most common one we see is like, hey, we're having a lot of problems with our partner. We don't want to spend more money, but we're having a lot of problems. And, as you dig into it with them, it turns out because of those problems, they have an office manager with a primary job, that they should be focusing on. And then it turns out they're spending 15 hours a week, hand holding IT processes, owning IT processes.
That's it. Office managers and engineers are doing IT all over the place.
Yeah. And so then it turns out, as you peel that back, the spend is much higher than they even think it is. And so, if we can get them to a right size place, they do ultimately end up saving money.
And becoming more productive, I think. And the other thing,
much improved employee experience, right? That's the big thing that I try to, I think, visualize at the end of it and talk through, is the goal is for the employees to have a great experience on their tools.
Yeah. And you talked about too, you've used the word partner a lot. And when we're talking about kind of this idea that our current MSP isn't as good, I think part of what I hear in that is we're looking for a better partner, right? Because one of the things that I really take pride in, and I know you do too, because it's like, I think it's the most fun part of onboarding that we ever do is we start with finance. And all of a sudden we're finding thousands of dollars in annual savings. I mean, I think we've probably saved companies upwards of $250,000 a year on licensing, which then will offset the price that they're paying for our services. And I say our services, not just any MSP, because I don't know that people dig into that level. And I think that always feels like such a win, but you don't get that unless you're in a partnering relationship, right? Because a lot of times people are like, well, it's no skin off my back. Like, you're paying for all this stuff and I'm not really watching it because I don't feel like you pay me for it. So it's this weird thing that I think is as much about personalities and, and kind of coming together as a team, as a partnership, that is one of the keys that we try to do as well.
I think you help leaders get there by, being, like I said, being consultative and helping educate them on what's possible. Right. And it doesn't have to be with us. Like, there isn't a hard sell when we're talking to these companies at the end of the day. We are really just trying to highlight what a strong, successful partnership could look like, with us or somebody else who's really competent.
Kind of giving people an idea of what they should be looking for in those conversations. Because you're right, it's not at least for us, it's not ever been a hard sell. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I feel like talking about hard sells and is kind of a good segue for this, but another thing that I feel like we've been talking about a lot internally is this kind of race to the bottom that is being spurred, I think, by the private equity investment in IT. There's tons of roll-ups happening in the space. Talk about kind of the experience that we've observed when private equity comes in and buys your MSP.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that private equity is heavily invested in the MSP industry, at this point. Just like anything, when you're trying to consolidate and expand on those revenue numbers, those profit numbers, some things have to go. And it's really clear in those scenarios where you see service delivery drop off, where you see challenges with service. And I think, we're really tapped in with the community, the places where IT folks congregate online, and there's very common storylines and threads around that experience that companies struggle with. I don't think every PE relationship is probably like that, but I think that there is a prevalence of service drop-offs after your partner has been bought out and rolled up into a larger company, and it seems like it's hard to prevent, if you're growing a company really quickly. So at the end of the day, I think it's been really important for us, to talk about what makes us special, being privately owned, and not having a larger partner that we have to adhere to and sacrifice on our service delivery around. I think that is why we're able to bring, I think these kind of a higher level of service to the customers that we're supporting.
Well, and it's interesting because I think you're absolutely right. It's not like every integration to a larger MSP or private equity backed platform company has to be tricky, but it also kind of brings me back to this level of enterprise experience that we have at TenisiTech, because we've done tons of M&A work as a company, also in our prior careers, right? So we actually know what those transitions should feel like in a good scenario, what they shouldn't feel like. And I think some of that is, again, it goes to the experience of the people that you're working with, right? Like, I always felt like it was important for us to think of the end user experience before anything else. And I think that that's a little bit different in that space of roll-ups, right? It's like, we got to get this done. And I mean, I've been told by companies that, hey, it's going to be a race for the bottom. And that's not really fun to think about, because I don't think in our entire history, we've thought about how do we be the cheapest. I think we talk about how do we provide the best service at a fair price. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge that those of us that are private or that are worried about private equity will have to keep navigating for the foreseeable future.
I don't think we've ever stripped down a services proposal and removed what we believe to be critical, important services and had a partnership work out well. It's very hard to pick and choose when you talk about something as foundational to your business as, infrastructure, IT security. Those are things that, these days are table stakes, right? When you talk about the risk businesses face with their data, when you talk about the requirements for uptime and availability, it needs to be there. It's like having your power bill paid and, ensuring that your building has electricity or that your water is on, right? And so, I think we're really clear on that from our perspective.
So final question for you. When you're working with prospect, what do you feel like business owners, IT owners, and when I say IT owners, I mean the people within a business who own IT as a service, like, what do you feel like, let's say, the top 3 things that they need to be focused on when they're talking with MSPs. Like if you're the business owner, what are the things that you really need to get hyper focused on to kind of cut the noise and help figure out who the right team could be for you?
I mean, that's a great question. I think one of the big ones up front is understanding really quickly what's included in the service. Is this everything you need, like we were talking about, to have a successful IT operations team running in the background? Or is this a very piecemeal proposal, right? Am I just getting, one sliver of the service needed, and then am I going to end up having to pay a bunch more after, I've signed this contract and started with this company? Or am I going to be, concerned about having to call them because I know my bill's going to go up every time
That's a really common one, right? Like I have to call somebody after hours, and that's like a time and a half type request, where all of a sudden you're paying $300 an hour to call somebody after 5 p.m. or whatever. So that's a good one, is really understanding what's included. What else?
And then I want to know where their team is. I think a big thing that allows us to win over and over again is we have a local and regionally based team that's around the customers we support here in the United States, and that makes a big difference when you talk about availability, to be in the same time zone, to answer the phone when those offices come to work, whether that is on the East Coast, in Central or Mountain Time, or here in California. We have strategically placed employees. And then the final thing is, I think, that diverse experience on their bench. Do they have these different skill sets, these cybersecurity experts, these, automation and development experts on their team? And have they been doing this a while?
Right. Like, so even to ask, like, who's on your team, what's kind of some of the history there? I mean, that's always a tricky one too, because it's not like we're going to provide resumes. I feel like that's kind of a yesterday thing. The MSP you're hiring should be able to speak to projects, experience, and
they should be able to talk to their successes, from a high level, what those look like, and ultimately, prior to signing, have references to back those up if needed.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of I think those 3 would be ensuring what they're proposing as the service, knowing what the extras might be. Like I think a common extra for everyone would be project work. Project work's always going to be extra, for example. So really getting
those cybersecurity tools like that are requirements in 2025. Are those included, or are you going to be hit with an extra proposal right after you sign to get those tools?
Yeah. So what's included, who's doing the work, and where are your people? I love that. That's all super people focused for the most part. Well, thank you so much for talking about this. I feel like you and I could talk about all the things over hours and hours. So I know we're going to do another one of these soon, but that's kind of outsourced pricing. Like Carlos said, he's available for any consultative conversations. You'd be surprised at how many people share proposals with us that we give feedback on. And you'd also be surprised that sometimes the feedback is they're doing a good job and it's a fair price. I mean, I kind of also pride us on being able to not pick apart someone else's work, because, IT is as much an art as it is a science at this point. So Carlo's available to be consultative. You'll be able to reach him via LinkedIn or our contact forms. All of those will be in the notes of the show. And I look forward to having another conversation with you soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me on. Talk later. Bye.